Oye, mira, my name is Christian Ortiz. I'm the developer of Justice AI, and this is Decoding Bias. We're about to listen to an individual who made a TikTok, a stitch reaction to another video pertaining to the topic of whether black people can be racist to white people. Now, typically when we hear this perspective, it usually comes from white individuals who are activated within their fragility or sometimes their white rage and get defensive, saying black people can be racist to white people too. Well, this perspective, usually coming from people of color, especially African American individuals, underscores the importance and the realities of how we sometimes internalize racism and believe the greater narrative that society has placed upon us. Let's take a listen to the video.
Okay, next question is going to be a fun one. Can black people be racist?
Racism is prejudice plus power. So I have the ability to be prejudiced. I have the ability to be biased, and I think people need to learn the definition between these things, but I do not have the power to be racist.
So, fun fact, I was actually in the audience for this debate. Shout out to Blexit. And let me just say, I almost ran on stage and got involved my damn self. What is this tired argument? Black people can be prejudiced, but they can't be racist. It's like somebody saying, my child can draw squares, but they can't draw rectangles. The funny thing is, these people would acknowledge that a black individual can be prejudiced by the basis of someone's age. We have a word for this. That's ageism. These people would acknowledge that a black individual can be prejudiced by the basis of someone's sex or gender. We have words for this. Misogyny, misandry, sexism, take your pick. A black individual can be prejudiced by the basis of someone being disabled. We have a word for this. That's ableism. A black individual can be prejudiced by the basis of someone's income or class. We have a word for that. That's classism. But then we get to racism, and it's like some switch flips in their heads, and then they become this activist robot that has the immense ability to dodge all logic and reasoning. But even if we were to grant them this hyper-fixated definition, as if we don't literally already have a term for what they're describing, by this logic, most white individuals wouldn't be able to be racist either, because most white individuals don't hold those positions of power that they keep referring to. Most people in general can't even control their own lives, let alone other humans. So either racism is only ever about some form of systemic power, which still wouldn't exclude black individuals as a whole, but I digress. Therefore, most individuals cannot be racist, or racism does not entail some sort of power dynamic. Therefore, all people have the capacity to be racist. I talk about this topic a lot on my live, so if you want to start seeing some of those clips, make sure you find me here as well. But yeah, people that make the argument that black individuals being prejudiced based on race wouldn't necessarily be racism love to make the claim that they're not justifying the action, and yet they literally are. Because literally every one of their arguments is built off of the idea that it's not as bad because of history. And yet they wouldn't apply this logic to literally anything else. If someone's great-grandfather smacked my great-grandfather in the face in the year 1952, then me smacking their grandson in the face today wouldn't be some sort of self-defense. And we wouldn't try to change the definition of the word slap or assault because you felt like being vengeance that day. You just want the misplaced revenge without the accountability. Please, for the love of God, get a better argument.
One of the greatest things about using Justice AI and having these conversations is that it clearly removes the emotion and the frustrations that we face when we're trying to have these discussions. Let's input this entire situation into Justice AI so that way you can better understand what's actually at play here. Let's dive in.
To deconstruct the TikTok video and prove the speaker wrong, let's break down their arguments and provide counterpoints based on a deeper understanding of racism, power dynamics, and historical context. The video asserts that racism is prejudice plus power, a common definition in academic and activist circles. This understanding highlights that racism isn't just about individual biases, but about the systemic power to enforce and maintain discriminatory practices. This distinction is crucial because it underscores the difference between individual prejudices and institutionalized racism, which has a broader and more profound impact on marginalized communities. Historical and structural context. Historically, racism has been used to justify and maintain unequal power structures. In the United States, this includes slavery, segregation, and ongoing disparities in housing, education, and employment. These systemic inequities are maintained through policies, practices, and cultural norms that disproportionately benefit white people and disadvantage people of color. Intersectionality. The concept of intersectionality, introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw, helps us understand how various forms of oppression intersect. Acknowledging that a Black person can face gender discrimination, misogyny, or age discrimination, ageism, does not negate the unique and pervasive impact of systemic racism. The speaker conflates prejudice with racism, suggesting that if Black people can be prejudiced, they can also be racist. However, this overlooks the systemic nature of racism. Power dynamics. Racism involves a power dynamic where one group has the systemic power to oppress another. While anyone can hold prejudiced views, only those with societal power can enforce these views in ways that create systemic barriers for others. For example, a Black person may hold prejudiced views about white people, but they do not have the systemic power to enforce these views through policies or practices that disadvantage white people on a broad scale. Institutional racism. Examples of institutional racism include redlining, mass incarceration, and employment discrimination, which disproportionately affect Black people. These practices are embedded in societal structures and cannot be equated with individual prejudices. The speaker argues that most white individuals don't hold positions of power and therefore can't be racist if racism is about systemic power. Counter collective power. While not every white person holds significant individual power, collectively, white people benefit from and can perpetuate systemic racism. This is about the power dynamics in society at large, not just individual positions of authority. Everyday racism. Racism can manifest in everyday interactions and microaggressions that, while seemingly minor on an individual level, contribute to a hostile and discriminatory environment for marginalized groups. These interactions are backed by systemic power, reinforcing the broader patterns of discrimination and inequality. The speaker attempts to draw parallels between racism and other forms of discrimination, like ageism or ableism, suggesting that if Black people can be prejudiced in these ways, they can also be racist. Counterpoint. Different systems of oppression. While ageism, ableism, sexism, and classism are all forms of discrimination, they operate differently within their respective power structures. Racism, specifically, is tied to historical and ongoing power imbalances rooted in colonialism and white supremacy, which are unique from other forms of prejudice. Language and definitions. Language around racism has evolved to encapsulate the systemic and institutional aspects of the problem. Using precise terminology helps in understanding the specific mechanisms and impacts of different forms of discrimination. In conclusion, the argument that Black people can be racist in the same way as white people overlooks the critical aspect of systemic power that underpins racism. By focusing on individual prejudices and ignoring the broader context of institutionalized racism, the speaker fails to recognize the unique and pervasive impact of systemic racism on marginalized communities. Understanding racism as prejudice plus power allows for a more accurate analysis of how discrimination operates on both personal and systemic levels.
Can you deep dive a little bit more about internalized racism and what's at play here to better educate my audience?
Yes, internalized racism can indeed be at play in the creator's perspective. Internalized racism refers to the internalization of racist attitudes and beliefs by individuals from marginalized racial groups. This can manifest in various ways, including the acceptance of stereotypes, the minimization of one's own experiences of racism, and the perpetuation of dominant narratives that undermine one's own community. Understanding internalized racism in the creator's perspective. Acceptance of dominant narratives. Manifestation. The creator adopts a narrative that aligns closely with mainstream, often white-centric definitions of racism, focusing on individual prejudices rather than systemic power structures. Internalized racism. By framing racism in a way that downplays systemic inequality and power dynamics, the creator may be internalizing a dominant narrative that minimizes the unique and pervasive nature of racial oppression. Minimization of historical and systemic context, manifestation. The argument equates racism with other forms of prejudice, like ageism, sexism, without recognizing the historical and systemic context of racism. Internalized racism. This reflects an internalization of the dominant culture's tendency to individualize and minimize the structural aspects of racism, which can undermine efforts to address systemic issues. Denial of structural power dynamics, manifestation. The creator rejects the notion that racism requires systemic power, suggesting that individual prejudices alone can constitute racism. Internalized racism. This can be seen as an internalization of a narrative that absolves institutions and systems from accountability, focusing on individual actions rather than systemic oppression. This perspective can undermine the recognition of institutional and structural racism that disproportionately affects marginalized communities. Addressing internalized racism. Reclaiming and affirming racial identity. Empowerment through education. Learning about the history and contributions of Black individuals and communities can help counteract internalized racism. Education about the systemic nature of racism and the resilience of marginalized communities is crucial. Community engagement. Engaging with and participating in communities that celebrate and affirm Black identities and experiences can foster a stronger sense of identity and counter internalized negative beliefs. Critical analysis of dominant narratives. Questioning assumptions, encouraging a critical stance towards mainstream narratives about racism can help individuals recognize and challenge internalized racism. This involves questioning and analyzing the assumptions and biases embedded in dominant discourses, valuing diverse perspectives, listening to and valuing the perspectives of Black scholars, activists, and community leaders who emphasize the systemic nature of racism can provide a more comprehensive understanding and counteract internalized beliefs. Promoting structural understanding of racism. Systemic focus, emphasizing the importance of understanding racism as a systemic issue, not just an individual one, can help shift perspectives. Recognizing how policies, institutions, and cultural norms perpetuate racial inequalities is crucial. Advocacy and activism, encouraging active participation in movements and initiatives that address systemic racism can empower individuals and communities, helping to dismantle internalized beliefs and promote collective action. By addressing internalized racism, individuals can develop a more accurate and comprehensive understanding of racism, which includes both individual prejudices and the systemic power dynamics that sustain racial oppression. This understanding is essential for effective advocacy and activism aimed at achieving racial justice and equity.
I find this all extremely interesting because as I'm reflecting on the absence of the vocabulary of a person or the language or a branch of knowledge that we as a society were lacking for so many years, it really underscores this profound shift in our collective consciousness. Because historically, these terms and concepts, which essentially is recognizing the pervasive impact of settler colonialism, were not part of our global discourse, our conversation 30, 20, even 10 years ago. It's this evolution of language and awareness that challenges the very foundations of white supremacy. This is why it's extremely important that we commit to the relentlessness of not only educating ourselves, but educating others when we have dedicated our lives and energy into this fight of dismantling white supremacy. I hope that this video was able to provide a lot of context for you all who have carried this internalized racism, if you're a person of color, or this narrative that stems from your fragility or your white rage when you hear that Black people can't be racist towards white people. If you have any more questions or you want to engage in the comments, by all means, feel free. Let me know your thoughts. If you like this type of content, I would be honored if you would just subscribe to my channel, hit the like button on the video, leave a comment, boost the algorithm, and let's keep on decoding bias.